Hey, my name's Lily. This video will be a quick history into the fishing rights held by the Mi'kmaq people of Canada. I should point out, I am not Mi'kmaq. I am Indigenous, but very much not an expert. As such, this is not a deep dive into the importance of the land for the Mi'kmaq people. I will be discussing a few court cases and the Constitution, and if that interests you, please stick around. Links to the referenced materials will be available in the description. Thank you for watching. Would you be surprised if I said the lobster industry generated a lot of money? In 2014, Nova Scotia had fished about $570 million worth of lobster. That's 51,000 metric tons. With that much money on the line, it would make sense why competition can get so fierce. Currently, there is a competition between Mi'kmaq fishers attempting to fish for lobster and non-Indigenous fishers trying to stop that from happening. So I'm here to clear up some of the past surrounding the Mi'kmaq people and explain why the Supekne'katik lobster fishery is a constitutionally protected right. Have you ever thought about what North America might have been like before the Europeans came here? I mean, genuinely considered what it might have been like to live off the land. I wouldn't have survived very long. I'm pretty fragile. And for that reason, if I somehow survived into adulthood, I would probably have a strong tie to the land that took care of me. What I'm saying is that for the people of North America, they found great cultural importance to the lands and waters they occupied and relied on for survival. It was a part of their identity. For groups like the Mi'kmaq, who used their ocean access for resources and cultural practices, to separate them from the ocean would be to remove their way of life. So, fast forward through most of North America's existence, and we arrive at colonization. Specifically, 1752, as that was when an important treaty was signed. The Treaty of 1752 was signed between Chief Sachem of the Mi'kmaq Indigenous peoples on behalf of their tribe and their heirs for all eternity, and Peregrine Thomas Hobson, the Governor-in-Chief for Nova Scotia. There are a few different avenues of relations between the settlers and the Mi'kmaq covered by this treaty, and one of which is quite relevant for us. The fourth point mentioned in the treaty. It is agreed that the said tribe of Indians shall not be hindered from, but have free liberty of hunting and fishing, as usual, and that if they shall think a truck house needful at the river Chippecanoe, or any other place of their resort, they shall have the same built and proper merchandise lodged therein to be exchanged for what the Indians shall have to dispose of, and that in the meantime the Indians shall have free liberty to sail to Halifax or any other settlement within this province, skins, feathers, fowl, fish, or any other thing they shall have to sell, where they shall have liberty to dispose thereof to the best advantage. This part of the treaty introduces the concept of hunting and fishing rights for the Mi'kmaq people. The guarantee to freely hunt and fish is needed, as well as to sell their wares on the market if they so wish to do so. The treaty right to hunt, fish, and have access to markets has been established. Realistically, any negotiated contract could change in its terms, but only if renegotiations happen with mutual consent. So, if at some point between 1752 and now it could be shown the rights in the treaty were negotiated away in part or in full, maybe then the right to hunt and fish would no longer be guaranteed. In 1980s Nova Scotia, the RCMP charged one Mi'kmaq man by the name of Simon for possession of a rifle and shotgun shells. These items were, at the time, violations of the Nova Scotia Lands and Forests Act. Simon stated in court that not being permitted the use of the aforementioned items was a violation of his treaty right to hunt. The provincial court sided with Simon, stating the Treaty of 1752 was still valid. Another cool thing happened in the 80s in Canada. The Constitution Act of 1982 brought some changes. Section 35(1) acknowledges the existence of Aboriginal and treaty rights and affirms these rights as valid. Treaty and Aboriginal rights now have constitutional protection. Another legal case of note is that of Denny, Paul, and Silly Boy. The three Mi'kmaq fishers were charged for fishing for salmon and cod without licenses, illegally possessing salmon, and fishing for salmon with a snare. The court had to decide whether not having the proper equipment and licenses was a crime, or if requiring these items would infringe upon the treaty right to fish. The courts concluded that Denny, Paul, and Silly Boy would be acquitted since the fishery regulations would prevent the three men from exercising their Aboriginal right to fish. The appeal also pointed to the Constitution Act of 1982, which requires priority for Aboriginal fishing once the needs of conservation are met. This court decision refers specifically to Aboriginal rights. Aboriginal rights are based on identity, of which the land and ocean are a part of for the Mi'kmaq. This means that by virtue of being sovereign people with their own way of life, the court said that their way of life is to be prioritized over other fishing interests. This decision does note that Aboriginal fishing rights can still be regulated, but they gain priority post-regulation. So that whole constitutional protection thing? Yeah, so the Supreme Court attempted to find a way around it. Entering stage left, we have Sparrow, a Mi'kmaq man who was attempting to fish with a net that broke regulations. You may be asking yourself how his net broke regulations, and the answer is simple. The regulations changed. Between seasons, the maximum depth of nets allowed was decreased, and so Sparrow's net was no longer allowed. Sparrow argued in court that not being allowed to use his net infringed on his right to fish as a Mi'kmaq person. The courts ultimately agreed with Sparrow, and he was released. This case led to the court's development of a super straightforward system to decide when it was considered okay to infringe on the constitutional rights of people. First, the group claiming infringement would need to prove infringement had taken place. Following that, the Crown would be required to justify their infringement. This can easily be shown how it could work in the case of Sparrow. If the Crown wanted to prevent Sparrow from using his deeper-than-regulation fishing net, they could do so, if there was proper justification. If the Crown could show there were concerns over conservation, this would be a proper justification. It is important to note, however, that we previously mentioned that the Aboriginal right to fish must be preserved over other fishing interests. So, in the case of Sparrow, the Crown could stop Sparrow from fishing for conservation concerns, but Sparrow's ability to fish must still be preserved over commercial and sports fishing. As such, the burden of conservation would fall more heavily on the non-priority fishing groups. If you've been paying attention to the situation with the Sepeknekatik livelihood fishery, you have probably heard reference to the Marshall decision or the Marshall case. I think a big reason why this case specifically is referenced more often than the ones I mentioned before is because of the direct connection to the market access portion of the Treaty of 1752. Donald Marshall Jr., a member of Membertou First Nations, was fishing at Pomket Harbor. He caught and sold about 210 kilograms of eels for $787.10. Marshall was charged for fishing without a license, fishing during a closed season, and selling eels without a license. The Supreme Court looked at the case, which was presented to them in September 1999, and they affirmed Marshall's right to catch and sell eels despite the closed season and lack of a license. Following their decision with Marshall, the Supreme Court states that the Mi'kmaq people have a right to hunt, fish, and gather so that they may earn a moderate livelihood. This moderate livelihood is further denoted as being about securing the essentials rather than the unlimited accumulation of wealth. The Supreme Court does offer a little bit of clarity on their decision in November of that same year, where they say that treaty rights are not unlimited and that fisheries could be regulated. Of course, for regulations to occur, there would need to be reasonable justification to restrict constitutionally protected rights. The point of all of this has been to establish a legal precedent we can work with. Marshall had been fishing for eels while the season was closed. He was then trading these eels in order to provide a livelihood for his family. The Supreme Court affirms that Marshall is well within his right to fish for and sell eel, while non-Indigenous fishers could not due to the season being closed. Marshall could fish for a resource other people were not allowed to fish for due to his rights as a Mi'kmaq person. The other key piece of information from Marshall was the statement that the Mi'kmaq would be guaranteed the right to fish in pursuit of a moderate livelihood. The court said this was limited by needing to be below the endless accruing of wealth. On the other hand, it can't be lower than the bare minimum needed to survive, and would probably need to generate savings, as the ability to retire after a life of work is part of earning a livelihood, I presume. I'm assuming it isn't expected that the Mi'kmaq work until they die, but I think most of us in the world are expected to work until we drop dead, so who knows. The only clarification the Supreme Court offered on Marshall was that they could in fact still infringe upon treaty rights if justification could be provided by the Crown. September 17th, 2020, 21 years after the Marshall Decision, Sepeknekatik First Nation launched their own self-regulated commercial lobster fishery in Saulnieville, Nova Scotia. The Sepeknekatik livelihood fishery is currently operating while lobster season is closed. This has prompted backlash from non-Indigenous fishers who believe the operation to be illegal. One of the claims that seems to be made is that allowing the fishery to operate out of season will deplete lobster stocks and damage the long-term health of the industry. It should come as no surprise that Sepeknekatik First Nation says they are regulating the fishery and are operating it in accordance with their right to fish in pursuit of a moderate livelihood. In this instance, Chief Sack offers his idea of what a moderate livelihood should be for his people. He believes the average Nova Scotian income should be a starting point for what a moderate livelihood is. With the amount of money the lobster fishing industry makes in Nova Scotia, Chief Sack's definition for a moderate livelihood seems fairly reasonable. The Sepeknekatik Band holds 30 commercial fishing licenses, each allowing for 50 lobster trap tags. 10 of these licenses have been distributed as of October 1st. It may be a commercial fishery, but the scale it operates on is minuscule. Most arguments focus not on the scale of the fishery, but on its operating while out of season, meaning it isn't quite about how many lobsters Sepeknekatik plans to fish, but that they plan to fish at all during this period. I am not going to pretend to know if the size of this fishery would damage the lobster population. What I know for a fact is that I've been setting up a legal precedent. The precedent that when fishing at any point of the year for personal consumption or sale on the market, the Supreme Court has affirmed the Micmac right to do so repeatedly. Attempting to challenge the issue should be in the dictionary as the definition of insanity. The court sided with Marshall selling eels out of season. They would side with Sepeknekatik. It is possible that the Sepeknekatik livelihood fishery may require regulation by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. I provided the simple rights infringement process earlier, and that could very well be brought out if damage to the lobster population ends up being a real concern, despite experts claiming otherwise. If that happens, though, the Sepeknekatik fishery will still be prioritized in its ability to operate over other fishing interests. I would wager the industry as a whole probably wouldn't want to have to fish less to let the Micmac get a market share, and I think this would be the outcome if any regulation were to be required by the DFO. The Sepeknekatik livelihood fishery is protected in its operations under the Constitution. A bunch of non-Indigenous people crying that life isn't fair won't change legal precedent. It isn't special treatment. It's respecting a contract that was made to be able to share land that was stolen from a sovereign people. Respect Aboriginal rights, even if you don't understand why they have them. They exist due to the blood, sweat, and tears that cover the past of this country. If you stuck around this long, thank you so much, and I hope you found this interesting. So this is very clearly an amateur production recorded through a cheap web camera. Any feedback would be appreciated. I really appreciate if you watched this. Thank you so much. Love you all. Have a good time. Peace.